You've made it into bed. Maybe the sheets are a little cool against your skin. Maybe the pillow still smells faintly like laundry detergent, and you're ready for a slow drift into sleep. But tonight, before your eyelids grow heavy, let's take a strange kind of trip backward, thousands of years, to a world where rivers carved not only landscapes, but the very foundation of human life. Welcome to Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the place historians call the Cradle of Civilization. The name sounds almost mythical, like a setting in a fantasy novel, yet it was very real, vivid, muddy, noisy, inventive. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe to the video, only if you like what I'm doing here. And if you don't mind, share your location and your local time in the comments, because there's something fun about knowing where fellow dreamers are tuning in from. Now turn off the lights, turn on the fan for a soft background hum, and let's go on a nighttime journey together. You hover above a great plain, and below you the Tigris and Euphrates cut through the earth like two long silver ribbons. Together they form a giant letter Y, cradling fertile soil that once turned hunters into farmers and nomads into villagers. Mesopotamia wasn't just one place, but a stretch of land running through modern-day Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Kuwait. From this patchwork of riverbanks rose the very first cities: Uruk, Babylon, names that feel ancient and heavy, like stones worn smooth by centuries of rain. The rivers were everything here. They fed the fields, carried boats heavy with goods, and occasionally threw tantrums in the form of unpredictable floods. Imagine being a farmer, having worked weeks to plant your barley and date palms, and then suddenly, whoosh, the river swallows it all. That unpredictability shaped Mesopotamian life. People didn't just survive the rivers, they learned to tame them, digging canals, building levees, and inventing some of the first irrigation systems. Without water control, there would have been no surplus grain, and without surplus grain, no cities. Fact number 1, the earliest large-scale irrigation projects in history started here. You stroll along one of those canals now, the muddy banks cool against your bare feet. Villagers in linen skirts bend down with baskets, scooping water with simple tools called shadows, basically long wooden poles with a bucket tied to the end. You notice kids splashing around while their parents scold them half-heartedly. The sound is timeless, like any riverbank anywhere. Funny to think thousands of years ago kids were already ignoring chores. It wasn't just farming that the rivers allowed, they were highways. Wooden boats floated up and down, carrying clay, reeds, wool, and yes, beer. That's fact number 2. Mesopotamians brewed beer daily, and it was often safer than drinking water. Historians even found recipes scratched onto clay tablets, making Mesopotamian beer possibly the earliest documented craft brew. You picture someone raising a foamy bowl of it and saying "to another good harvest," the world's first toast. As you drift, you see cities rising in the distance, shimmering like mirages. Uruk, for example, might have been the world's first true city. At its peak, around 2800 BCE, it held perhaps 40,000 people. That doesn't sound like much compared to modern megacities, but for its time, Uruk was astonishing. Fact number 3, its walls stretched 6 miles long, said to have been built by the legendary king Gilgamesh himself. Of course, whether Gilgamesh was real or just myth is still debated. But the city? That was solid clay, brick, and sweat. The rivers not only nourished crops and cities, but also imaginations. Fact number 4, Mesopotamian myths often tied directly to water. They believed the god Enki lived in the underground freshwater ocean, the Abzu, and controlled wisdom, magic, and craft. To them, water was never just H2O. It was a divine gift, and sometimes a divine threat. If you've ever had your basement flood, You probably agree. Here's a fun oddity for fact number 5. Mesopotamians might have been the first to create a map. On a small clay tablet, someone drew a diagram of the world, with the Euphrates running straight through it like a cosmic highway. It wasn't accurate in a GPS sense, but it showed how central the river was in their worldview. You smile. People back then already needed directions. By the riverbanks, farmers led oxen dragging wooden plows. Fact number 6. This was one of humanity's greatest inventions. It multiplied food production, freeing up others to become potters, merchants, scribes, and priests. In a sense, the plow was the quiet hero of civilization. Without it, your bedtime story tonight might have been about, well, hunting wild goats in the dark. You pause at a fishing boat, where two men are hauling up nets heavy with carp. Fish was a staple food, alongside bread, dates, and onions. Not glamorous, maybe, but nourishing. And here's a tiny joke buried in history. Clay tablets mention complaints about lazy fishermen. Apparently, workers slacking off is older than written language itself. Speaking of language, fact number 7, the rivers provided clay, and clay gave us writing. People scooped up river mud, shaped it into tablets, and pressed reed styluses into it. That's how cuneiform was born, the world's first writing system. Without the rivers supplying that endless clay, would humanity have ever recorded its first words? Imagine a future archaeologist digging up our smartphones the way we dig up clay tablets. Same idea, just with better battery life. Finally, fact number 8, the rivers weren't just practical, they were poetic. Mesopotamians often described them as living beings, sometimes gentle, sometimes violent, always powerful. To them, the rivers mirrored human life itself, full of nourishment but also chaos. Historians still point out that this duality shaped Mesopotamian religion, politics, and even their philosophy about the human condition. If your entire life depends on rivers that can save or destroy you, you learn early that existence is fragile, and so you float onward, lulled by the soft lap of water against the banks. The Tigris and Euphrates glitter beneath the moon, silver threads weaving humanity's first great story. Sleepier now, you can almost hear the whisper of reeds swaying, as though the land itself hums a lullaby. The sound of water fades as you drift into a quieter space. The air here feels heavier, tinged with the earthy smell of baked mud. You glance around and notice people hunched over small rectangular slabs, their hands steady, their eyes intent. They're not sculpting idols or making toys. No, they're etching symbols into clay. Each press of a reed stylus leaves behind wedge-shaped marks. Congratulations, you've just arrived at the birth of writing, the invention that would outlast kings and outshine empires. You bend down, running your finger across one of the tablets. The marks are neat, almost rhythmic, like the grooves of an old vinyl record. Fact number 9, this is cuneiform, the world's first writing system. Developed by the Sumerians around 3200 BCE, it began not with poetry or prayers, but with simple bookkeeping. Imagine scratching into clay, 2 sheep, 3 jars of beer, and then letting it harden in the sun. That was the start of history. Literally, writing meant memory could be extended beyond the human brain. Fact number 10, cuneiform was originally pictographic. A drawing of a fish meant, well, fish, but as trade and society became more complex, the symbols evolved into abstract marks. It's as if emojis slowly morphed into an alphabet over a few centuries. And much like modern texting, not everyone was good at it. Some tablets show obvious rookie mistakes, like a scribe running out of space and awkwardly squeezing words into the corner. Humanity has always struggled with margins. You notice a man nearby wearing a simple robe, muttering as he carves. He's a scribe, part of an elite group who could read and write. Fact number 11. Most Mesopotamians were illiterate. Scribes were the gatekeepers of knowledge, bureaucracy, and storytelling. To be one was like being part wizard, part accountant. They attended schools called edubas, where they memorized thousands of signs. Picture the stress, long hours, strict teachers, clay dust in your hair. One surviving tablet is basically a student's angry note complaining about his teacher being unfair. Turns out, homework drama is eternal. Another tablet catches your attention. It's covered in numbers and neat columns. Fact number 12. Mesopotamians invented a base 60 mathematical system. That's why we still measure time in 60 seconds per minute, 60 minutes per hour. The idea that something scribbled into wet clay thousands of years ago still controls your alarm clock today is both impressive and, frankly, a little annoying. Not all writing was math, though. Fact number 13. Mesopotamians also recorded myths, prayers, contracts, and even jokes. One ancient Sumerian proverb reads, "Something which has never occurred since time immemorial. A young woman did not fart in her husband's lap." That's right, world's oldest written joke. You can't help but laugh softly. Somehow, knowing people 4,000 years ago were still cracking jokes about bodily functions makes the whole cradle of civilization thing feel oddly human. But then your gaze lands on a tablet unlike the others. The surface is covered in a sprawling tale filled with heroes, monsters, and quests. Fact number 14. Mesopotamia gave us the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest known epic story. Written in cuneiform on clay tablets, it tells of a king searching for immortality, wrestling with gods, and ultimately learning about the limits of being human. It's essentially the prototype for every hero's journey since. Without Mesopotamia, no Odysseus, no Frodo, no Marvel movies. Though, to be fair, Gilgamesh probably wouldn't have worn spandex. You glance up at the scribes and notice their expressions, some weary, some proud, some bored. Fact number 15. Writing wasn't always grand. Often it was mundane. Most tablets were contracts, receipts, or lists. Farmers recording livestock, merchants tallying trade, priests noting temple donations. If you squint, history starts to look a lot like paperwork. Yet those piles of paperwork are what allow us to reconstruct their world. Without clay tablets, Mesopotamia would have been little more than rumor. And here's an odd twist for fact number 16. Clay's durability is why we know so much. Papyrus in Egypt rotted, parchment in medieval Europe crumbled, but clay baked hard during fires. Even when cities were destroyed, their libraries accidentally became time capsules. You almost picture future archaeologists digging up our hard drives after a Wi-Fi apocalypse, muttering, "Why did they take so many cat photos?" Fact number 17. Writing also helped kings consolidate power. Hammurabi's famous law code, for instance, was carved into stone so no one could claim ignorance. The idea of "it's written down, so it must be true" was born here. A scribe's wedge marks could determine justice, taxes, even life or death. The stylus was in some ways sharper than any sword. As you continue wandering, you notice tablets filled with stars and symbols. Fact number 18. Mesopotamian scribes recorded astronomical observations, mapping the heavens with surprising precision. They tracked the movement of Venus, phases of the moon, and solar eclipses. Some scholars argue their records laid the groundwork for modern astronomy. You imagine a tired scribe squinting at the night sky, jotting notes, while secretly wishing he could just go back to bed. Here's where things get even stranger. Fact number 19. Scribes sometimes wrote messages to the future. One Akkadian tablet literally says something like, "This is for those who come after us." You feel a sudden shiver, realizing that you, thousands of years later, are exactly who they were writing for. Their wedge-shaped whispers made it all the way across time to your pillow tonight. Finally, for fact number 20, cuneiform lasted for over 3,000 years. That's longer than the Roman alphabet has been around so far. Yet eventually, it disappeared, forgotten, buried under layers of earth. By the time Greek historians wrote about Mesopotamia, hardly anyone alive could still read it. It wasn't until the 19th century that scholars cracked the code again, unlocking thousands of forgotten voices. Imagine if, one day, English vanished for millennia, only to be rediscovered in the far future. Someone would be scratching their head, translating memes. You lean back, the clay tablets surrounding you like glowing screens in a dark library. The air is still, the stylus marks seem to pulse with hidden energy. And as you drift towards sleep, you realize something. Every bedtime story, including this one, owes its existence to those ancient scribes. Without them, no written words would have survived to lull you tonight. The wedge marks whisper, steady and soft, as your thoughts sink deeper into the cradle of history. The tablets fade from your sight, and in their place, you see something vast rising against the horizon. At first, you think it might be a mountain, glowing golden in the setting sun. But as you drift closer, you realize it's no mountain at all. It's built by human hands, a stairway of mud brick climbing toward the heavens. Welcome to the world of ziggurats, the towering monuments of Mesopotamia. The first thing you notice is their sheer size. These were no small shrines or village chapels. Fact number 21, the Great Ziggurat of Ur, one of the most famous, originally stood about 70 feet high, with 3 giant terraces stacked like steps. To climb it would be like walking up a miniature mountain made of clay. And unlike pyramids in Egypt, which were tombs, ziggurats were temples, places meant not for the dead, but for the living gods. You hover near the base, where priests in long white robes carry baskets of offerings, barley cakes, bowls of dates, jugs of beer. Fact number 22, each ziggurat was dedicated to a specific god. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, for example, was built in honor of Nana, the moon god. Imagine climbing all those steps just to leave a basket of fruit at the top. You can almost hear someone muttering, "The gods better appreciate this." The walls are steep, the bricks sun-baked and heavy. Fact number 23, ziggurats were made of millions of mud bricks, often with a baked outer layer to protect against rain. The Mesopotamians didn't have stone quarries like Egypt, so they used what they had, river mud. Practical, yes, but fragile. Many ziggurats eventually eroded back into the earth, like castles built from wet sand. You ascend slowly, the air warming as if each level brings you closer to the sun. Fact number 24, ziggurats often had shrines at their summits, believed to be the literal homes of the gods. Only priests and royalty were allowed inside. Ordinary people worshipped at ground-level temples, never setting foot on the sacred heights. You wonder, did those priests feel awe or just exhaustion from hauling themselves up every day? As you reach the middle terrace, you hear a chant carried by the wind. Priests recite hymns in Sumerian, their voices rising like incense. Fact number 25. Mesopotamians believed ziggurats connected heaven and earth. They were called bond between heaven and earth in some texts. To climb one was symbolically to approach the gods, step by step, kind of like humanity's first skyscraper, except instead of elevators, they had sweaty processions. Here's an odd detail for fact number 26. Archaeologists discovered that some ziggurats were brightly painted. Instead of dusty brown, imagine dazzling blues, gleaming whites, and shining gold caps. The ziggurat of Babylon, possibly the inspiration for the biblical Tower of Babel, was said to have glazed tiles of lapis lazuli blue. Against the desert sky, it must have looked like a piece of heaven dropped on earth. You think about our modern city skylines, glass towers lit with neon, and realize humans have always tried to outshine the night. You pause at the top, where a small shrine sits waiting. Inside, a bed and table stand ready, as if for a guest. Fact number 27. Some texts suggest the gods were believed to physically descend into these shrines. Priests prepared meals and beds for them, treating the divine as honored guests. You imagine a priest muttering, "We cooked for you, we cleaned for you. Could you maybe bless the crops this year?" The relationship between gods and humans was, let's say, a little transactional. But ziggurats weren't only religious symbols. Fact number 28. They were also political power statements. Building such a massive structure took thousands of workers, years of labor, and endless resources. When a king built a ziggurat, he wasn't just honoring the gods, he was showing his people and his rivals that he had the power to reshape the earth itself. It was as much about divine authority as it was about human ambition. In that sense, the ziggurat was the ancient version of saying, "Look what I built, don't mess with me." Historians still puzzle over some things. Fact number 29. No one is entirely sure if regular worship happened inside the ziggurat shrines, or if they were mainly symbolic residences for gods. Some argue they were ceremonial, others think daily rituals took place. The truth may be somewhere in between. It's one of those enduring mysteries, the kind that makes history feel more like a dream than a record. From up here, the view is breathtaking. The Euphrates glitters in the distance. Villages cluster like beads along canals, and smoke curls lazily from hearths. You see oxen pulling plows, children chasing goats, merchants shouting at one another over silver weights. And in the middle of it all, the ziggurat towers, a man-made mountain declaring that humanity would not simply bow to the earth, they would build their own bridge to the sky. Fact number 30. Ziggurats may have influenced later architecture far beyond Mesopotamia. Some scholars see echoes of their design in Mesoamerican pyramids, Indian temple towers, even in medieval cathedral spires. The impulse to climb higher, to pierce the heavens, seems baked into our species. You glance up at the modern night sky, skyscrapers glowing like electronic ziggurats, and can't help but feel the resonance. And here's a joke tucked into history. One Babylonian tablet mentions complaints about lazy workers on temple projects. Even back then, people were dodging shifts on construction sites. You almost hear someone groaning, "Not another brick, my back's killing me." Civilization may change, but Mondays are eternal. You lie down at the summit, where the bricks still radiate stored heat from the day's sun. The shrine feels hushed, timeless. Somewhere below, life continues. Markets, farms, laughter, arguments. But up here, it's quiet, as if the whole world holds its breath. You close your eyes, and for a moment, you almost believe the gods really did climb down those stairs to share in human company. The ziggurat stands steady against the night sky, a silhouette of ambition and devotion. Its terraces catch the moonlight, each level glowing faintly as though alive. And as you sink further into drowsiness, you realize the truth is simple. These towers weren't just about reaching gods, they were about reaching possibility itself. Humanity looked at the flat earth and said, "We can make mountains." You descend from the ziggurat's shrine, the bricks cooling beneath your feet, and wander into the shadowed courtyards of the city. The air carries the smell of incense, thick and sweet, drifting out from temples where priests murmur prayers. You expect gods to feel distant, untouchable, like stars beyond reach. But in Mesopotamia, the gods were strangely human. Fact number 31. The Mesopotamians had a pantheon of hundreds of gods, each tied to aspects of daily life. They weren't flawless beings sitting on thrones of light. They argued, feasted, fell in love, grew jealous. In other words, they behaved a lot like their worshippers. If you've ever seen a family bicker at a holiday dinner, you've already glimpsed Mesopotamian mythology in miniature. The most important trio were Anu, Enlil, and Enki. Fact number 32. Anu was the sky father, distant and aloof, the god who technically ruled the heavens but rarely got involved. Think of him as the CEO who never shows up to the office. Enlil, god of air and storms, was more hands-on and often destructive. He once sent a great flood to wipe out humanity, a story eerily similar to later biblical tales. And then there was Enki, the clever god of water and wisdom. Unlike the others, he often helped humans, sneaking them advice or tricks to survive. You might call him the original life hack influencer. The goddesses were no less vivid. Fact number 33. Inanna, also called Ishtar, was the goddess of love, war, and fertility. Imagine that combination, romance and chaos, in one divine package. Her myths describe her seducing lovers, starting wars, and once descending into the underworld just to prove she could. If she had a modern profile, her bio might read, likes passion, dislikes being ignored, may declare war if left on read. One of the strangest and most powerful stories is hers. Fact number 34. Inanna's descent into the underworld is one of the oldest recorded myths about death and rebirth. Stripped of her clothing at each gate, judged by her sister, and killed, she eventually returned to life, an ancient precursor to resurrection themes that appear in later religions. Historians still point out how deeply her myth echoes across cultures, showing that human fascination with mortality and renewal is as old as civilization itself. But Mesopotamian myths weren't just cosmic, they were everyday. Fact number 35. There was a god for beer, Ninkasi, a goddess of grain, Ashnun, and even deities for household objects. Life was unpredictable, so everything needed a divine supervisor. If your oven broke, maybe it wasn't your bad luck. Maybe you forgot to honor the spirit of ovens. It's comforting in a way. Instead of blaming yourself, you could just blame the gods. Here's a bizarre one. Fact number 36. In one myth, Enki got drunk on beer and gave away the sacred powers of civilization, called the Me to Inanna. These powers included things like truth, music, and kingship. He basically handed over society while tipsy. You picture him the next morning, groaning, "Wait, I promised you what? Oh no." Humanity's first hangover regret story, right there in the clay tablets. You wander further, and the streets fill with noise. Priests carry statues of the gods in elaborate processions, their robes trailing through the dust. Fact number 37. Mesopotamians believed the gods actually inhabited their statues during rituals. These weren't symbolic objects, but living presences. When a statue was washed, fed, or dressed, it was the god receiving care. You glance at one massive golden idol and wonder if it's blinking when no one looks. Not every god was benevolent. Fact number 38. Demons and spirits roamed the Mesopotamian imagination too. Some, like Pazuzu, with a terrifying face and wings, were invoked to drive away worse evils, like the demoness Lamashtu, who preyed on mothers and infants. Protective amulets and charms were common. It makes you think, are our modern nightlights and sleepy playlist rituals really that different? Here's a funny detail for fact number 39. Prayers sometimes scolded the gods. People would remind them, "Hey, I gave you offerings, so could you not smite my crops this year?" The relationship wasn't blind devotion, it was negotiation, faith, but also bargaining, almost like customer service. "I filed a request. Please resolve my issue within 3 days." And fact number 40, Mesopotamian gods were deeply tied to nature's unpredictability. Floods, droughts, storms, all were seen as divine moods. The idea that the gods were moody and unreliable probably came straight from the rivers themselves. Just like you saw in Section 1, life depended on water, but water could turn against you overnight. Their gods weren't cruel for the sake of it. They were mirrors of the fragile balance between survival and disaster. As you listen to the myths swirl around you, you notice something comforting in their chaos. These gods weren't perfect, and maybe that's why they felt relatable. They loved, they made mistakes, they threw tantrums. In their messy divinity, Mesopotamians found explanations for life's own unpredictability. A small child runs by, carrying a clay figurine of Inanna, giggling as though the goddess herself is a toy. You can't help but smile. The gods may have demanded reverence, but they also lived in bedtime stories, in songs, in laughter. Myth wasn't just about control, it was about wonder. The temples fade into the quiet hum of the night, the incense thinning into starlight. You feel a strange closeness to these ancient people, imagining them sitting by lamplight, telling stories about storm gods and moon deities, trying to make sense of the world. Thousands of years later, here you are, lying in your bed, doing the same. The gods may not be listening anymore, but their habits, their stories, their laughter still ripple in the silence like echoes in the river of time. The incense smoke dissolves into the night air, and as you drift farther, the chanting of priests fades into another sound, one that is harsher, more commanding, voices raised in proclamation, scribes jotting down words, and soldiers standing stiffly at attention. You've wandered into the realm of kings, the men who claimed authority not only over people, but also somehow under the watchful eyes of the gods. Fact number 41. Mesopotamia gave us the world's first true kingship. Before this, villages may have been ruled by councils or priests, but by around 2900 BCE, kings began to emerge as central figures. They weren't just war leaders, they were seen as chosen by the gods to maintain order, and order was everything. Without it, the rivers would flood unpredictably, harvests would fail, and cities would crumble. You stand in a bustling court, the smell of baked bread and the sweat of petitioners mixing into the air. A man kneels before the throne, begging for a ruling in a dispute over land. The king listens, stroking his beard. He's not just a political leader, he's a symbol of divine justice. Fact number 42. Many kings portrayed themselves as mediators between gods and humans. They built temples, restored canals, and led armies, all while insisting it was their sacred duty, not just personal ambition. Convenient, really. What better excuse for power than the gods told me so? One of the most legendary rulers appears in the whispers around you, Gilgamesh, king of Uruk. Fact number 43. Gilgamesh may have been an actual king who reigned around 2700 BCE, later mythologized into a half-god hero. The Epic of Gilgamesh painted him as a restless seeker of immortality, but at his core, he was still a king, organizing his city, building walls, and leaving behind stories that blurred reality and myth. But kingship wasn't all about grand tales. Fact number 44. One of the most famous Mesopotamian contributions to human history was the creation of codified law, and no name looms larger here than Hammurabi of Babylon. Around 1754 BCE, he issued his famous law code, inscribed on a tall stone stela. You can almost see it now, the black basalt gleaming under torchlight, with neat rows of cuneiform chiseled deep into its surface. The laws were detailed, sometimes startlingly so. If a builder constructs a house that collapses and kills the owner, the builder shall be put to death. Harsh but effective quality control. Fact number 45. Hammurabi's code is one of the oldest surviving examples of written law, and it covered everything from property disputes to family matters, wages, and medical malpractice. Imagine being a doctor and knowing that a bad surgery could literally cost you your life. Talk about pressure. Fact number 46. The principle of lex talionis, the famous eye for an eye, was central to Hammurabi's code. It wasn't always about brutal punishment. It was about proportionality. Justice meant balance. If you wronged someone, the harm you caused had to be mirrored back. That idea still echoes in many modern legal systems, even if we don't carry it out so literally anymore. But here's a twist. Justice wasn't equal for everyone. Fact number 47. Punishments varied depending on social class. If a noble injured another noble, the penalty might be severe. If a noble injured a commoner, the fine could be far lighter. Justice, it turns out, was stratified. Your worth in the system depended on your rank, so maybe humanity hasn't changed as much as we like to think. You wander past scribes who copy down these laws onto clay tablets, distributing them across the land. Fact number 48. Literacy gave kings enormous control. Most people couldn't read, so they relied on officials to interpret the law. Imagine being told, "The tablet says you owe me 3 goats," and not being able to check for yourself. Kings ruled not just with armies, but with words etched into clay. The court noise softens for a moment, and you hear the echo of another figure, Sargon of Akkad. Fact number 49. Sargon, around 230-34 BCE, created what many historians call the world's first empire, uniting Mesopotamian city-states under one rule. His story is legendary, abandoned as a baby, placed in a basket, and set afloat on a river. Yes, a tale that strangely parallels later biblical narratives. He rose from obscurity to command thousands, conquering city after city. His name meant true king, and his empire stretched farther than anyone before him dared. But even the strongest kings faced limits. Fact number 50. When rulers failed, when floods weren't controlled, or enemies triumphed, or temples fell into disrepair, their legitimacy crumbled. Kingship was always precarious, always tied to performance. People could revolt, gods could withdraw favor, and dynasties could vanish as quickly as they rose. Stability was an illusion, one constantly rebuilt on clay foundations. Historians still debate, were these kings truly beloved, or were they tolerated out of fear and necessity? Some records describe rulers as shepherds caring for their flocks, while others suggest tyranny, greed, and endless warfare. The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. Leadership, like the rivers, was never entirely gentle. As you step out of the throne room, the torches flickering low, you feel the weight of it all, the voices of rulers, the scrawls of scribes, the judgments carved into stone. Law and order may have kept chaos at bay, but they also revealed something deeply human, the constant attempt to structure life, to make sense of fairness, even in the most fragile of worlds. And somewhere in the distance, you still hear the murmur of Hammurabi's words echoing through time. Justice, written down for all to see. Even if not all were truly equal beneath it, the idea was planted that law could outlive kings, and that society could be bound not only by force but by rules. The night stretches, and the voices of ancient rulers dissolve into the hume of your fan. Kings and lawgivers may be gone, but their shadows linger, quiet and enduring, like the faint outline of a crown in moonlight. The courts grow quiet, the king's voices fading into memory. You wander back into the streets, where a very different sound rises to greet you, not commands or decrees, but chatter, laughter, the rattle of goods, the clink of silver. You've stumbled into the beating heart of everyday Mesopotamian life, the marketplace. The first thing that hits you is the smell. Spices waft through the air, garlic, cumin, coriander, mingling with the earthy scent of fresh bread baked in clay ovens. Chickens squawk from wicker cages, goats bleat as they're tugged toward buyers, and somewhere in the distance, you catch the fizzing pop of beer jars being opened. Fact number 51. Mesopotamian markets were lively centers of trade, where farmers, herders, potters, and merchants gathered daily to swap goods. Forget malls and supermarkets. This was where civilization itself went shopping. You pause by a stall piled high with shiny stones. A merchant waves a polished piece of lapis lazuli in your direction, the deep blue glinting like a frozen star. Fact number 52. Lapis was imported all the way from Afghanistan, hundreds of miles away. Trade routes stretched astonishing distances, connecting Mesopotamia to Persia, Anatolia, and the Indus Valley. This wasn't just local bartering, it was globalization, Bronze Age style. Nearby, another merchant sets out bolts of woven wool, dyed in earthy reds and yellows. Fact number 53. Textiles were one of Mesopotamia's most important exports, alongside grain, dates, and beer. In return, they imported tin, copper, and wood, things their flat, river-fed plains lacked. The city depended on trade not only for luxuries, but also for survival. You realize something odd. Civilization grew not from isolation, but from Kani. The courts grow quiet, the king's voices fading into memory. You wander back into the streets, where a very different sound rises to greet you, not commands or decrees, but chatter, laughter, the rattle of goods, the clink of silver. You've stumbled into the beating heart of everyday Mesopotamian life, the marketplace. The first thing that hits you is the smell. Spices waft through the air, garlic, cumin, coriander, mingling with the earthy scent of fresh bread baked in clay ovens. Chickens squawk from wicker cages, goats bleat as they're tugged toward buyers, and somewhere in the distance, you catch the fizzing pop of beer jars being opened. Fact number 51. Mesopotamian markets were lively centers of trade, where farmers, herders, potters, and merchants gathered daily to swap goods. Forget malls and supermarkets. This was where civilization itself went shopping. You pause by a stall piled high with shiny stones. A merchant waves a polished piece of lapis lazuli in your direction, the deep blue glinting like a frozen star. Fact number 52. Lapis was imported all the way from Afghanistan, hundreds of miles away. Trade routes stretched astonishing distances, connecting Mesopotamia to Persia, Anatolia, and the Indus Valley. This wasn't just local bartering, it was globalization, Bronze Age style. Nearby, another merchant sets out bolts of woven wool dyed in earthy reds and yellows. Fact number 53. Textiles were one of Mesopotamia's most important exports, alongside grain, dates, and beer. In return, they imported tin, copper, and wood, things their flat, river-fed plains lacked. The city depended on trade, not only for luxuries, but also for survival. You realize something odd. Civilization grew not from isolation, but from connection. Fact number 54. Instead of coins, Mesopotamians used silver by weight as currency. Picture a scale balanced carefully with tiny pieces of cut silver called shekels. If you wanted a jar of oil, you'd haggle until both sides agreed on just how many grams of silver the deal was worth. It's strangely familiar. You can almost hear someone today complaining about gas prices, except back then it was sesame oil. At one stall, a man hands over a clay tablet instead of silver. You lean closer and notice marks pressed into the wet surface. Fact number 55. Trade wasn't just verbal, it was recorded. Merchants used contracts written in cuneiform to guarantee exchanges. I give you this many goats, you owe me that much barley. If one party tried to cheat, the tablet was proof. You imagine a Mesopotamian lawyer saying, Exhibit A, this very muddy piece of clay. You drift further down the crowded lanes, catching fragments of sound. A woman shouting prices, children darting through the crowd, a musician plucking a lyre to attract customers. Fact number 56. Professional merchants became a distinct social class in Mesopotamia. Some grew wealthy enough to rival landowners. Their fortunes built on trade caravans and clever deals. In a sense, they were the first entrepreneurs, proving that even 4,000 years ago, someone was figuring out how to scale the business model. But not everything was cheerful. Fact number 57, disputes in markets were common. That's why laws like those in Hammurabi's code spelled out rules for contracts, debts, and wages. If you couldn't pay a debt, you might be forced into debt slavery, working for years to repay what you owed. In that sense, Mesopotamian shopping came with risks far heavier than buyer's remorse. The air shifts slightly as you notice donkeys lined up at the city gate, their packs bulging. Caravans arrive, their drivers sunburned and dusty. Fact number 58, donkeys were the backbone of Mesopotamian transport, carrying goods across desert paths long before camels took over in later centuries. These caravans linked city to city, empire to empire, and with each arrival, new stories flowed in alongside the goods, tales of faraway lands, unusual foods, strange customs. The marketplace was as much about imagination as it was about trade. Here's an odd little detail for fact number 59. Beer wasn't just for drinking, it was also used in wages. Workers often received daily rations of beer, measured carefully. So when someone says their job pays in beer, they might be more historically accurate than they realize. You picture a worker sighing after a long day, clutching his ration bowl. Well, at least payday tastes good. The hum of the market continues as night falls, torches flickering to life. A group of scribes sit cross-legged, tallying accounts, their styluses clicking against clay. Fact number 60. Mesopotamians invented some of the first systems of credit and interest. Merchants could borrow silver or grain, promising repayment with a little extra added on top. Banking, in its earliest form, was alive and well in these bustling bazaars. And yes, people complained about high interest rates even then. Some things never change. As you wander past the stalls, you feel the rhythm of it all. Goods exchanged, scales tipped, contracts signed, debts negotiated, caravans unloaded. This was no mere marketplace, it was the nervous system of civilization. Without trade, the temples wouldn't rise, the scribes wouldn't write, the kings wouldn't rule. Every barley seed, every jar of oil, every cut of silver carried the weight of a growing world. Historians still debate. Fact number 61. Was Mesopotamian trade driven more by necessity or ambition? Some argue it was survival, importing raw materials they couldn't produce. Others say it was wealth and prestige. Kings wanted dazzling stones, exotic woods, and fancy goods to prove their power. Maybe it was both. After all, survival and ambition have always been awkward dance partners in human history. As you pull back from the crowd, the market lights blur into soft glows. The sounds of bargaining fade into a murmur, like a lullaby sung in the rhythm of trade. And you realize something, the hum of commerce is as old as civilization. Every receipt, every paycheck, every card swipe at a grocery store, they all trace their ancestry back to these markets, by the rivers, where silver was weighed, beer was poured, and humanity learned the art of exchange. The night air cools, carrying with it the faint scent of bread and cumin, and you let the weight of history settle gently into your chest. Civilization, it seems, was not built only by kings and gods, but by merchants counting coins, mothers haggling for onions, and caravans trudging in from the horizon. The torches of the market flicker out behind you, and the night air shifts again. You follow the sound of rustling reeds and the low groan of oxen until the bustling noise of trade gives way to something older, quieter, and more patient, the rhythm of farming. Civilization may have thrived in temples and markets, but its roots, quite literally, were sunk deep in the soil. You step onto a wide plain where barley fields ripple under the moonlight like a sea of silver. Fact number 62. Barley was the staple crop of Mesopotamia. Easy to grow, hardy enough for the climate, and versatile, it could be baked into bread or brewed into beer. In fact, barley was so important that wages, rations, and debts were often measured in sila, roughly a liter of grain. If money makes the modern world go round, barley made Mesopotamia spin. You crouch low and see farmers guiding heavy wooden plows through the damp soil. Fact number 63. The Mesopotamians invented the cedar plow, which not only broke the ground, but also dropped seeds in neat rows at the same time. Imagine the time saved compared to scattering seeds by hand. It was like upgrading from dial-up internet to broadband. Suddenly, everything sped up. The oxen grunt, their shoulders straining as they pull the wooden frames. Fact number 64. Domesticated animals were essential farm workers. Oxen pulled plows, donkeys hauled water, goats and sheep provided milk, meat, and wool. Farming wasn't just about crops, it was a web of plants and animals supporting each other, and by extension, humanity. You realize this might have been the first real version of teamwork, humans and beasts pulling civilization forward together. But farming wasn't peaceful. Fact number 65. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers often flooded unpredictably. Unlike the Nile in Egypt, which rose and fell in a fairly reliable cycle, Mesopotamian floods were chaotic. One year, the fields would be blessed with fertile silt. Another, crops would be drowned. Too much water or too little, and the harvest could collapse. Living here was a gamble every season, one that shaped the anxious relationship Mesopotamians had with their gods. You glance up and notice a small canal snaking off from the river, its banks lined with reeds. Fact number 66. Mesopotamians dug massive networks of irrigation canals, levees, and dikes to control water. These were community projects, requiring cooperation on a huge scale. No single farmer could redirect a river, but together, villages could carve a lifeline into the earth. Irrigation wasn't just engineering, it was social glue. A farmer waves you over, proudly showing you a pile of onions, lentils, and dates. Fact number 67. Mesopotamian diets were surprisingly varied. Alongside barley, they grew chickpeas, lentils, onions, garlic, cucumbers, and date palms. Dates especially were treasured, eaten fresh, dried, or made into syrup. You pop one in your mouth and it tastes like sticky sunlight, sweet and earthy. Suddenly, breakfast cereal feels a little boring, but not everything grew easily. Fact number 68. Salinization, salt buildup in the soil, was a major problem. Irrigation water carried minerals that over time made fields less fertile. Some scholars believe this ecological issue contributed to the decline of Sumerian cities. Imagine working the same land for generations, only to watch it slowly turn into desert under your feet. Even ancient farmers wrestled with sustainability. A group of children dart past, balancing baskets of reeds on their heads. Fact number 69. Reeds were as valuable as crops. They were used for baskets, mats, boats, and even writing tablets. Walk along a Mesopotamian river, and you'd see reeds everywhere, swaying in the breeze, rustling like a soft percussion section in nature's orchestra. They were the plastic of the ancient world, cheap, versatile, everywhere. As you follow the children, you spot a row of palm trees swaying gently. Fact number 70. The date palm was called the tree of life. It provided food, shade, wood, fiber, and even wine. One tree could sustain a family in dozens of ways. Some farmers saw their palms almost like extended family members, silent, rooted companions who gave generously year after year. Of course, farming wasn't all back-breaking labor. There were festivals tied to the agricultural calendar, moments when the harvest was brought in and people celebrated together. Fact number 71, the Akitu festival, celebrated at the New Year, often coincided with planting or harvesting cycles. It was a time of feasts, rituals, and symbolic renewals when the king reaffirmed his right to rule by demonstrating he could keep the fields fertile. Farming wasn't just survival, it was ritual, rhythm, identity. Historians still debate. Fact number 72, did farming make life better or worse? On one hand, it supported cities, writing, trade, and everything we've been exploring tonight. On the other, it tied people to hard labor, vulnerable to weather and rulers. Some argue that early farmers worked longer, harder hours than hunter-gatherers. Yet, without those barley fields, no Mesopotamian civilization would have existed. You almost wonder if those first farmers realized the bargain they were making with history. Here's a light-hearted oddity for fact number 73. Some ancient proverbs complain about lazy farmers, much like workers in the ziggurats and markets. One tablet grumbles that a man spent more time napping than tending his fields. You chuckle somewhere. 4,000 years ago, a neighbor was basically subtweeting his friend for skipping chores. The night grows cooler, the fields shimmering under the stars. You lie down in the soft earth, feeling the hum of insects, the whisper of barley brushing in the breeze. And it strikes you, while kings made laws and merchants weighed silver, it was these farmers who quietly kept everything alive. Every brick in the ziggurat, every line of cuneiform, every sip of beer, none of it would have existed without plows cutting into the soil and seeds slipping into furrows. The oxen shuffle nearby, their breath steaming in the cool air, while the distant river murmurs like a lullaby. Farming was never glamorous, rarely heroic, but it was the slow, steady heartbeat of Mesopotamia. And as you let your own heartbeat slow to match that rhythm, you understand civilization's roots were muddy, messy, and full of toil. But from them grew a story that still feeds us, even in the quiet hours of the night. The fields fade behind you, and the hum of crickets gives way to something sharper. The thud of marching feet, the clash of metal on shields, the low growl of horns calling men to arms. Civilization may have been fed by farmers and sustained by trade, but it was defended, sometimes brutally, by warriors. You now walk alongside them in the land where organized warfare first became a defining part of human history. Fact number 74. Mesopotamia was a patchwork of city-states, and they fought constantly. Uruk, Lagash, Kish, all of them competed for land, water, and influence. With the rivers as both lifelines and borders, disputes over irrigation canals often turned into wars. Imagine neighbors today arguing over a shared fence, except this time it's 5,000 farmers and an army of spearmen charging at dawn. You pause before a tall mud brick wall. Fact number 75. Mesopotamians built massive city walls for protection, some stretching for miles around. The most famous were the walls of Babylon, said to be so thick that chariots could ride along the top. From the ground, they look like giant sleeping beasts, both protective and intimidating, warning any would-be invaders that entry would not come cheap. A soldier strides past, bronze blade glinting in the torchlight. Fact number 76. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was the cutting edge of weaponry. Swords, daggers, axes, and spearheads forged from bronze gave Mesopotamian armies a serious advantage. The tin had to be imported from far away, which meant wars were fought not just for land, but for access to the trade routes that fed the forges. You notice another odd detail: the soldiers' helmets. Fact number 77. Early helmets were made from copper or even thick leather, shaped like inverted bowls. They look almost comical to modern eyes, like someone wearing a shiny upside-down pot. But they worked well enough to deflect blows, and in battle, fashion wasn't the point, survival was. Further ahead, a group of men huddle around a set of long poles tipped with sharp heads. Fact number 78. The spear was the backbone of Mesopotamian armies. It could be thrown or used in close combat, and when hundreds of soldiers formed ranks with spears bristling outward, they became a deadly wall of points. Archers, too, were key, sending waves of arrows into enemy lines long before swords clashed. You can almost hear the snap of bowstrings, the hiss of arrows cutting through the dark. Fact number 79. The world's earliest depiction of organized warfare comes from Mesopotamia, the famous Stele of the Vultures, carved around 2450 BCE. It shows King Anatum of Lagash leading soldiers in tight formations, trampling enemies underfoot. The name itself is eerie. Vultures swoop down to feast on the fallen. It's a stark reminder that war has always been as much about spectacle as survival. You turn a corner and see a small group tending to strange two-wheeled carts. Fact number 80. The war chariot was a Mesopotamian innovation. These early versions weren't the sleek racing machines of later Egypt. They were heavy, clunky, pulled by donkeys. But they gave mobility and shock value, allowing archers to rain arrows from a moving platform. Think of them as the tanks of the Bronze Age, noisy, expensive, and terrifying if you were on the wrong side. Fact number 81. Armies weren't always professional. Often they were made up of citizen soldiers, farmers pulled from their fields when the city went to war. But over time, some rulers built standing armies, trained permanent forces ready to fight at any moment. Sargon of Akkad, the empire builder, was one of the first to maintain such an army, giving him a crushing advantage over rivals who had to scramble for manpower. The torchlight wavers, and you hear the low hum of a debate among modern historians. Fact number 82. Scholars still argue whether Mesopotamian warfare was mainly defensive or aggressive. Were city-states simply protecting canals and farmlands, or were they bent on conquest? Perhaps it was both. When survival depends on rivers and soil, drawing the line between defense and ambition becomes blurry. You find yourself in a quieter part of the city where a massive gate towers overhead. Fact number 83. Mesopotamian cities used gates not just for defense, but also for ritual and display. The Ishtar Gate of Babylon, covered in glazed blue bricks with roaring lions and dragons, wasn't only a barrier, it was propaganda in baked clay, telling everyone who entered that Babylon was powerful, wealthy, and divinely protected. And here's a strange, almost humorous fact number 84. Soldiers sometimes wore protective cloaks made of small overlapping metal scales, the earliest version of scale armor. From a distance, they looked like glittering fish walking upright. You imagine enemies thinking, are we fighting an army or a school of armored salmon? Yet war wasn't only about bloodshed. Fact number 85. Conquest also meant cultural exchange. Victorious rulers often brought home craftsmen, scribes, and new ideas. Armies carried languages, technologies, and myths across borders. Violence was destructive, yes, but it also stitched together the tapestry of civilizations, for better or worse. The marching sounds fade, replaced by the low, heavy silence that follows battlefields. Broken spears, shattered shields, footprints in the mud. You sense the cost. Warriors were not faceless pawns, but fathers, brothers, sons. Each life weighed in the gamble of city-state survival. And just like today, the cost of war was often paid by ordinary people. Farmers leaving their barley fields, families mourning by riversides. Still, Mesopotamians believed war had divine backing. Victories were seen as proof that the gods favored a city. Defeats, well, clearly the gods had turned their faces away. In this way, War wasn't just about weapons and walls, it was about faith, destiny, and the fragile human need to explain suffering. The stars glitter faintly above as you step away from the clang of bronze and the cries of warriors. The walls of Babylon shrink in the distance, their shadows falling across fields that will, tomorrow, be plowed again by farmers who pray for peace but prepare for war. You breathe in the cool night air, realizing that humanity's oldest cities were defended not only by mud brick and steel, but also by the belief that survival justified everything. The warriors sleep now, their swords resting at their sides, but the echo of their footsteps marches on through history. The clamor of battle ebbs away, leaving the night heavy and still. Yet as silence settles, you sense a presence not of soldiers or farmers, but of something older, larger, invisible. For in Mesopotamia, no action, no harvest, no war was ever truly separate from the gods. And now, under the starlit sky, you step into their realm. Fact number 86. Mesopotamians believed the world was ruled by a vast pantheon of gods, each responsible for different forces of nature and aspects of life. Anu, the Sky Father; Enlil, Lord of the winds and storms; Ea, or Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water; Inanna, goddess of love and war, equal parts passion and fury. Life was a constant negotiation with these divine powers, who could bless or destroy with a single gesture. You wander into a temple courtyard where priests chant under flickering oil lamps. Their voices rise and fall like waves, carrying prayers skyward. Fact number 87. Rituals were performed daily, offering food, drink, and incense to the gods. The statues inside temples weren't mere symbols, they were considered actual embodiments of the gods. Priests washed, dressed, and fed them as though the gods were honored guests in clay and stone form. Fact number 88. Religion wasn't separate from politics. Kings often claimed divine support, presenting themselves as chosen by the gods to rule. Some, like Naram-Sin of Akkad, even went further, declaring themselves gods while still alive. It was a risky move, glorious if accepted, blasphemous if not. Imagine your neighbor announcing at a block party that he is now divine and should be addressed as Lord of the Backyard Grill. Awkward doesn't even begin to cover it. You catch the soft strum of a lyre and follow it into a shadowed hall where stories are being sung. Fact number 89. Mesopotamian myths explain not only the origins of the world, but also the unpredictable nature of life. The Numa Elish, their creation epic, tells of Marduk slaying the chaos dragon Tiamat and forming the world from her body. The rivers, the earth, even the sky, all, in their telling, were carved out of chaos by divine struggle. One figure steps forward from the shadows, Inanna, fierce and luminous. Fact number 90. Inanna, or Ishtar, was one of the most complex deities. She embodied love, fertility, and sexuality, but also war, vengeance, and power. She descended into the underworld in one famous myth, stripped of her garments at each gate until she stood naked before her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. For 3 days she remained below, lifeless until rescued. This tale of descent and return echoes through later myths and religions, cycles of death, rebirth, and renewal. You drift lower, past the temples, into darkness. Fact number 91. The Mesopotamian underworld was not a place of fiery punishment or blissful reward. It was gray, dusty, and inevitable. All souls, no matter how noble or wicked, went below to dwell in the land of no return. The dead ate clay and drank stale water, shadows of their former selves. Grim, yes, but also deeply human, an honest acceptance that mortality was inescapable. The queen of this realm, Ereshkigal, rules with silence and inevitability. Fact number 92. Funerary practices reflected this bleak vision. Bodies were often buried beneath houses, so ancestors remained close to family life. Offerings of food and drink were left regularly, for if the dead were neglected, their spirits could grow restless and troublesome. Even in the afterlife, it seems, you couldn't skip dinner without consequences. A whisper of wings brushes past your ear, though no bird flies here. Fact number 93. Mesopotamians also believed in a host of spirits and demons, both protective and malevolent. Lamashtu, a terrifying female demon, was said to harm mothers and infants. To ward her off, people wore amulets of the protective demon Pazuzu, a fierce lion-faced figure with wings and talons. Imagine explaining to your kids, "Don't worry, this terrifying monster statue in your bedroom is here to keep you safe," comforting in its own way. Fact number 94. Astrology played a major role in religion. The movements of stars and planets were seen as messages from the gods. Priests, trained as diviners, interpreted eclipses, comets, and planetary alignments as omens of future events. A king might postpone a battle or alter policy based on the night sky's warnings. The stars weren't just distant lights, they were divine text, waiting to be read. Historians still debate. Fact number 95. Were Mesopotamians pessimists because of their grim view of the afterlife, or realists who simply accepted mortality? Some argue their myths reveal a sense of futility, that even heroes like Gilgamesh couldn't escape death. Others see wisdom here, a call to cherish life, to build cities, write stories, and drink beer precisely because eternity below was dull and certain. Perhaps both are true, the melancholy and the joy woven together like reeds in a mat. As you climb back from the shadows of the underworld, you hear one last story echoing, Gilgamesh's quest for immortality. Fact number 96. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero fails to gain eternal life, but returns wiser, realizing that human achievements, walls built, stories told, lives lived, were the closest thing to immortality. His lesson whispers across the millennia, you cannot live forever, but you can leave behind something that does. You step back into the starlight, temples glowing faintly in the distance. The gods remain silent, watching from their statues, from their stars, from the rivers themselves, and you realize something profound. Mesopotamian religion wasn't about personal salvation or eternal joy. It was about balance, keeping gods appeased, keeping spirits at bay, keeping life flowing in a fragile, unpredictable world. It was, in many ways, less about hope for the future than survival in the present. The night deepens and the stars swirl above like ancient signs only half deciphered. Somewhere, a priest lifts incense to Anu, another pours beer for Inanna, and a family whispers to their buried ancestors beneath the floor. The sacred and the ordinary blur into one continuous hum, reminding you that in Mesopotamia, the divine was everywhere, in the wind, in the flood, in the silence of the underworld. You breathe in slowly, letting the incense and the dust of ages settle into your lungs, and feel the weight of it, humanity's first attempt to answer the great questions. Why are we here? What lies beyond? And how do we live with the gods watching? Questions that, even now, still hover over our dreams. The temples and shadows recede, and the night begins to open into something larger, gentler. You've wandered through kings and farmers, scribes and warriors, priests and gods. Now in this last stretch of your journey, you pause and look back. The rivers are quiet, the reeds sway softly, and the echoes of Mesopotamia linger, not as ruins, but as threads still woven into your own life. Fact number 97. Mesopotamia gave us writing, and writing gave us memory. Every essay, every email, every note scribbled on a napkin can trace its ancestry back to clay tablets pressed with a reed stylus. The fact that you are listening to this story at all is because they started keeping records. Without them, civilization would have had no way to remember itself. Fact number 98. Mesopotamia gave us the wheel, not just for carts, but for pottery, transport, and later for turning gears of machines. Every car ride, every spinning record, every suitcase you roll across an airport floor carries a shadow of that first wheel creaking along the plains of Sumer. Fact number 99. Time itself, our days, our minutes, our hours, still owes its shape to Mesopotamia. Their sexagesimal, base 60 system divided the circle into 360 degrees, the hour into 60 minutes, the minute into 60 seconds. Every clock tick you hear tonight is their heartbeat, still measuring the world long after their cities crumbled. And then there is fact number 100. Mesopotamia gave us civilization, not as a finished product, but as an experiment. Cities, laws, markets, myths, they weren't perfect, they weren't eternal, but they were the first great draft of what humanity could become. Some parts we've kept, some we've abandoned. Some, like the search for justice and the longing for immortality, we still wrestle with under the same stars. Historians point out that Mesopotamia wasn't a single moment, but a long unfolding, rises and falls, empires built and lost, yet its echoes never truly vanished. Babylon appears in the Bible, in medieval myths, in modern slang. Gilgamesh's restless quest feels familiar in every story of a hero searching for meaning. Hammurabi's code lies hidden in the fine print of modern law. Even the frustration of salty soils and failed crops finds its echo in today's debates about sustainability. You lean against a stone worn smooth by centuries of touch and feel it hum with memory. The cradle of civilization is not a static place, it is a living whisper. It shaped not only the past, but the questions you carry into the future. What do we build? What do we owe each other? How do we live with the floods, both literal and metaphorical, that come without warning? And somewhere in that hum, Mesopotamia still speaks, not as ruins, but as a quiet reminder that the experiment of civilization continues, and you are part of it. The story slows now, like a river reaching the sea. The torches of Babylon flicker out, the songs of priests fade, and the walls of dissolve into starlight. You are left with only the hush of the night, the whisper of reeds, the soft hum of your fan. You've wandered through fields of barley, markets filled with silver scales, temples heavy with incense, and battlefields echoing with bronze. You've walked with kings and scribes, farmers and merchants, priests and warriors, and you've listened to their questions about life, justice, death, and the gods that are still, somehow, our questions too. But now the journey is over. The voices of Mesopotamia grow quieter, softer, folding themselves back into the shadows where they've waited for thousands of years. The clay tablets cool, the oxen rest, the gods retreat into the stars, and the rivers, eternal and patient, continue their slow, winding course. You lie back, letting the ancient dust settle into silence. Your breathing falls into rhythm with the night, steady and calm. The experiments of kings, the bargains of merchants, the prayers of priests, they drift away like clouds, leaving only the quiet certainty of sleep. The cradle of civilization cradles you too, now gently, without weight, without worry. The questions can wait until morning. The story has carried you this far, and now it sets you down softly in a place where dreams take over.